Yes. Very welcome. I start with that. But before we start the webinar, I just need to inform you that you can choose the language in which you want to participate. If you go to the bottom of the Zoom page, you find a globe. And there, if you click on that, you can choose Arabic or English. My name is Agneta Johansson, and I am the Executive Director of ILAC. I'm very glad to welcome you to this webinar, which is jointly organized with the Palestinian Centre for Human Rights and Al-Haq, and where we launch ILAC's most recent discussion paper, Access to Justice for Vulnerable Groups in Times of COVID-19 in Palestine. COVID-19 has contributed to widening what we call the justice gap worldwide. And we will hear more about that a bit later. And as usual, it is the most marginalized and vulnerable groups that are most affected. Today, almost 2 years after the outbreak of the pandemic, the question is no longer if people's access to justice have been impacted, but rather how far and what needs to be done now to prevent further escalation of unmet justice needs. In Palestine, the experience of marginalized groups in relation to COVID-19 must also be understood in the context of an already extremely difficult situation. I would say an almost impossible situation to start with. The decades of the Israeli occupation with all its human rights violations in practically all fields of life, with systematic repression and discrimination, the 14-year-long Israeli blockade and closure of Gaza, and all the consequences on human and economic life there, the armed attacks on Gaza and wars between Israel and Gaza that every time leaves Gaza more and more devastated. So it's important to bear that in mind, that COVID-19 came on top of all that. I'm mentioning this because the discussion paper and today's webinar focus mainly on the situation within the Palestinian justice system and its ability and challenges to deliver justice to the Palestinian population during the pandemic. And I do think that is very important and relevant to do. But I want to assure you that we are very well aware of that the COVID-19 situation came only on top of the situation that I described. And I want you to bear that in mind as well during this webinar. Because in both the West Bank and Gaza, COVID-19 has had serious and extensive impacts on people's access to justice. This study shows that cases of domestic violence, alimony, child support, custody, visitation rights were significantly impacted. Additionally, people subsisting in the informal economy, like day laborers and people in detention, they have also been particularly affected during COVID-19, as we will hear more about. Palestine is not unique in this case. We have reached similar, very similar conclusion in the 2 other reports in this series that we have been doing. The other 2 reports deal with Libya and Tunisia and are accessible on our webpage. There will be time for questions and answers in the end of the panel discussion. And if you have a question, please use the chat function and submit your questions to ILAC in a private chat. You can submit your questions throughout the webinar and they will be addressed in the end. And finally, I would also like to inform you that the webinar will be recorded and posted on ILAC's social media. We have a very an eminent panel with us today, and I will present them before they speak, but I just want to mention who they are now. We have Raji Sourani, Director of the Palestinian Centre for Human Rights, Saja Majdoubeh, representative of ILAC. We have Sarah Chamness from the World Justice Project, and we have Christopher Decker, who is from the UNDP. And finally, Ylva Hartman, a legal advisor at ILAC. We are very grateful for your participation in this panel. And I will start by giving the floor to Sarah Long from the World Justice Project. Sarah is a director for Access to Justice Research at the World Justice Project, where she leads the organization's efforts to collect and analyze people-centered justice data. And such efforts include the World Justice Project's Global Legal Needs Survey in 101 countries, calculating the global justice gap and producing new tools for designing data-driven justice service. I'm sure we will hear more about that from Sarah, who will set the scene and explain to us some impact on access to justice on the global scene. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Agneta, for that introduction, and to ILAC for inviting me to participate in today's important discussion. So for more than a decade, the World Justice Project has been producing data on rule of law and justice issues around the world. And while our various data collection efforts do not yet cover Palestine, they can still provide important insights into the impact of COVID-19 on vulnerable groups. So for my intervention today, I'd like to walk you through, one, what the data told us about the status of access to justice globally pre-pandemic. As Agneta mentioned, the issues that we're seeing today come on top of an existing challenging situation. Second, I'd like to talk about preliminary evidence on the impact of COVID-19 on access to justice. And lastly, what our rule of law index data just released today tells us about trends over the last year and a half. So in terms of the situation pre-pandemic, in 2019, just prior to the COVID-19 crisis, WJP published our Global Legal Needs Survey, which collected data from more than 110,000 households in 101 countries on the everyday legal problems that people experience and how they go about navigating those problems. So first and foremost, the study found that legal problems are very common, with nearly half of those surveyed experiencing at least one problem in the last 2 years. The survey covered 38 different types of legal disputes, but found that justice problems pertaining to employment, family, housing, money and debt, and public services were reported to be both the most prevalent and severe. So how did people go about navigating these problems? Fewer than a third of those who reported experiencing a legal problem turned to a third party for information, advice, or representation to help them better understand or resolve their problem. And even fewer, about 1 in 6 of those experiencing legal problems, turned to any authority or resolution mechanism, be it formal or informal, to mediate, adjudicate, or resolve their problem. And perhaps most troubling and relevant to today's discussion, we found that these problems were not randomly distributed, but instead marginalized groups experienced a greater number of legal problems and were less likely to be able to resolve them. So these groups included low-income populations, recipients of government benefits, and people with disabilities and long-term health issues. In addition, we also found that women were more likely to experience family disputes, including domestic and intimate partner violence, inheritance disputes, and problems pertaining to alimony and child support. Interestingly and troubling, they were also more likely to experience physical or stress-related ill health as a result of their justice problems as compared to their male counterparts. So what was the aggregate picture of these various justice barriers? That same year, WJP undertook a justice gap assessment to understand the scale and nature of unmet justice needs globally. And we found that 5.1 billion people, or approximately 2/3 of the world's population, faced at least one unmet justice need. And within that number, that includes 1.5 billion people who were unable to resolve their civil, criminal, and administrative justice problems. So pre-pandemic, we knew that the state of access to justice globally was troubling and that there was a large justice gap. But what did we see during the pandemic? While research is still underway and will take years to fully understand the impact of COVID-19 on legal needs and access to justice, preliminary evidence from justice experts, practitioners, and legal aid providers during the pandemic indicated that the economic fallout from the pandemic fueled justice problems related to employment, financial disputes, housing, and domestic violence, and that these also increased the need to access public services. So just as an example of the type of preliminary evidence we were seeing in this regard, in 2020, the U.S. Legal Services Corporation in the U.S. reported an 82% increase in requests for legal aid. So we were able to use this kind of data to understand that there was indeed a really big surge in legal need. But at the same time that we were seeing this surge, lockdown, social distancing, and social distancing measures increased barriers for people being able to resolve their justice problems. And they also hampered the ability of governments to respond due to limited staff capacity and constrained financial resources. However, this situation forced important innovations in justice service delivery, such as online legal advice and dispute resolution, which I'm sure my co-panelists will discuss in greater detail in the Palestinian context later during today's discussion. So where are we today? As I mentioned at the outset of my intervention, today's event is actually quite timely for looking back on global trends and access to justice over the course of the pandemic, as the WJP today is releasing the 2021 edition of our Rule of Law Index, which is designed to measure people's perceptions and experiences with the rule of law in 139 countries and jurisdictions. The Rule of Law Index measures the rule of law across 8 primary factors or dimensions of the rule of law, and these include civil and criminal justice. The data in our index is based on global surveys of more than 138,000 households and 4,200 legal practitioners. So this is the first edition that we've published since the WHO declared COVID-19 a global pandemic. And many of the trends in this latest edition of the index confirm an increase in justice barriers brought about by the pandemic that we were seeing in this preliminary evidence that I just mentioned earlier. Indeed, we saw that 70% of countries saw declines in their civil justice scores in the last year, and 67% saw declines in their criminal justice scores as well. This finding is particularly striking for civil justice, as it marks a departure from the previous pre-pandemic edition of the index, in which a majority of countries had actually improved their performance in the last year. So we see something of a reversal of this trend.
Sarah,
Yeah.
Well, I have a wish from the interpreter. If
Sure.
you can slow down a little,
it's
difficult to manage to interpret.
Of course, my apologies. So just one last note on the index data. If we take a closer look at what is driving these declines in the areas of civil and criminal justice in this most recent edition of our index, over the last year, 94% of countries saw declines in indicators pertaining to delays in administrative, civil, or criminal proceedings. Civil justice was particularly affected by delays, with 2/3 of countries showing delays in this area of justice. So the data that I've just described paint a stark but probably unsurprising picture, with prevalent legal needs borne disproportionately by marginalized groups, a large justice gap made worse by a global pandemic, and a majority of civil and criminal justice systems around the world struggling to respond. And while my co-panelists will likely discuss many of these challenges in the Palestinian context, I would like to actually end my intervention with a note of optimism, which is that we have this important data and research, both globally and thanks to ILAC at the national level for Palestine as well. This means we have a vital diagnostic tool for assessing key challenges and moving forward to close the justice gap that disproportionately burdens marginalized groups. And indeed, I appreciate that ILAC has linked these challenges to concrete recommendations for improving access to justice for vulnerable groups in Palestine. And I look forward to hearing my co-panelists discuss these further. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. A lot of information there in a short time, but hopefully we can get back to some of it. Let me now ask Ylva Hartman, who is a legal advisor at ILAC, to give her findings or presentation. Ylva has a background working with both humanitarian law and human rights law, And most recently now, she has been leading our work regarding the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on access to justice. And Ylva, you will present some of the findings in relation to access to legal representation and information. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Agneta, and thanks also, Sarah, for your intervention. It was very interesting and also nice to hear a spark of optimism also, because it is a very worrying picture that we are seeing and quite depressive, honestly. And I think it's important for us to see it also, as you were alluding to see it as an incentive to do more work and better work, and also to act as watchdogs to make sure that the COVID-19 pandemic is not used as a pretext to erode the rule of law even more. Because there are also lessons learned that we can use from the pandemic. And I will actually first make some observations that are common or similar between the studies that we have made in Palestine, Tunisia, and Libya on just focusing on COVID-19's effects on access to justice. And also, I will also present some other findings from the report on Palestine. And the discussion paper that we are launching today builds on a series of in-depth interviews with lawyers and judges. And the interviews were conducted by ILAC in the West Bank and by the Palestinian Centre for Human Rights in Gaza. And we don't pretend to provide an exhaustive overview of access to justice for vulnerable groups during COVID-19 in Palestine, but rather to highlight some tendencies that were expressed in the interviews. So starting on some observations from all of the studies and the three countries that we have covered, Palestine, Tunisia, and Libya, they are very diverse and difficult to compare, of course, and they were chosen because ILAC or ILAC members do work in relation to rule of law in these three countries. But there are some interesting observations that can be made, and I will focus on four of them before going into the Palestine report specifically. So first, during the pandemic, women were persuaded to waive their rights to a greater extent. In Palestine and Tunisia, many women were convinced to waive their rights to alimony, both in customary justice settings and by law enforcement personnel. So we had this also, it is already hard for someone to bring your complaint to dispute settlement. And when you come there, you are persuaded not to go ahead with your claim. And this was also seen in Tunisia when it came to domestic violence, where some members of the law enforcement dissuaded women to report the crimes. And when it comes to alimony, there were arguments put that there were difficult economic circumstances for the husband, for instance. But of course, the divorcee and the wife all face the same problems. And secondly, there was also an increased use of customary justice or informal dispute settlement since the judiciaries were closed in Palestine and Libya for limited periods of time. Or in Tunisia, they were also congested and only prioritizing some cases. And this, according to some of the interviewees in the studies, has undermined citizens' confidence in the ordinary justice system. and that will have repercussions also beyond the pandemic. And we also have the problematic disrespect of, in many circumstances, of women's and girls' agencies and agency and rights in customer dispute resolution mechanism. Thirdly, we have also the violation of people in detention's right to counsel and to physically appear in front of a judge. That has been the case in all of the 3 countries. Lawyers were prevented to meet with their clients and can't therefore advocate for their release or check for marks for torture, for instance. And I know that Saja will address this more in detail later, but I think it was interesting also to see that general tendency in the other countries. And fourth, what came across in all the 3 studies is the creativity, courage, and resilience of legal professionals in trying to do their work and to keep contact with their clients, and being very creative about working around the obstacles. And for instance, lawyers were covering for each other's hearings to avoid spread of infection, or staying in contact with their clients and meeting in creative ways, respecting social distancing, for instance, and also in some cases, reaching new groups of justice seekers via social media. So those were a couple of general observations from the 3 studies, also pertaining to Palestine. But moving on to the Palestine report, and more specifically also the issue of digitalization, which has been a hot topic of many legal professionals, and also as for rule of law organizations. We have also seen quite a lot of enchantment with the prospects of digitalization and how that can help. But and I want to stress also that many interviewees pointed out the importance of the long-term need to develop the digitalization of the justice system in Palestine, but also that this should be done in a holistic way towards improving access to justice more broadly, also encompassing analog access to justice and legal information, as well as improving the legal aid system, as was alluded to also by Sarah in her introduction, and how important that is for specifically vulnerable groups. And also when it comes to digitalization, what came across was that access to legal information should be prioritized and not necessarily rushing towards moving hearings online because of difficult access to internet, for instance, and also the risks of violations of fair trial rights and effective participation in remote hearings. And also a condition for digitalization is to improve digital literacy and infrastructure more broadly, taking into account the digital divide, of course. And one specific recommendation that was made by the legal professionals was to digitize the notification departments as a priority in Palestine, and the need to push through legislation to enable that digitalization. And just as a parenthesis or footnote, the notification departments, they are in charge of notifying the parties to each case of the timeline, hearings, and deadlines of the cases. And during the pandemic, there were enormous accumulation of notifications because hearings were adjourned, and people there was a need to re-notify parties. Which made the work even more difficult. And some interviewees noted that because many people were unaware of the time of their hearings, this affected negatively their trust in lawyers, as well as in the judiciary as a whole. which is of course very worrying. And when it comes to lawyers' contact with their clients, most lawyers manage to keep remote contact with their clients. Mainly, they preferred phones to do that. Social media was used by some. Some noted that it was easier to reach women and girls via social media, since it was not as easily controlled by male partners or guardians. But some have also reported the opposite. For instance, the Women's Centre for Legal Aid and Counselling reports that social media was increasingly controlled during home quarantine. So this is just to demonstrate that it is the digitalization in general is very complex, and it is very important to fully understand the implications for vulnerable groups of digitalization of judicial services. I don't have COVID, just a normal cold. Sorry. So the importance is that the legal needs of justice seekers should be put at the center, and these also in particular when dealing with digitalization, including improving legal aid and representation, because it is not as easy to persuade a person not to present the claim if accompanied by a lawyer or a paralegal. So COVID has presented us with also, I think, the need to rethink access to justice more broadly, and to put vulnerable groups at the center of those efforts. And I will conclude with that. Thanks.
Thank you, Ylva. Good conclusion. We'll probably get back to that discussion. Now it's time for our first Palestinian presenter, Saja Majdoubeh from ILAC. She is a Palestinian human rights researcher with a master's degree in public law, among other things. She has worked at ILAC as a research and studies coordinator. Currently, though, she is working as a civil society organizations project coordinator, a long title, at the UNDP, and also a research fellow at the UNESCO Chair on Human Rights, Democracy and Peace. Saja, I know that you will talk about maybe broadly from the West Bank, the findings, but especially you would like to talk about how COVID-19 has impacted people in detention. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Agneta, and good afternoon to everyone who has tuned in today. I'm extremely grateful for this platform to address such a very important issue witnessed during the crisis. And I would strongly thank the author Ylva and ILAC team for all the hard work they did in preparing this excellent report, as well as this webinar. In this brief, I will focus on the topic of people in detentions during the pandemic, and I will shed a light on mainly 3 subjects before discussing the report's recommendations in regard to people in detention. Those are Israeli discriminating policies against Palestinians in the detentions, and then in the Palestinian context, I'll address violations of the right to fair trial and due process, and the role of the NGOs or the civil society in monitoring the detention centers during the pandemic. As you may know, the pandemic happened in pre-existing bad conditions in both the Palestinian and Israeli detention centers, such as overcrowding, practices of torture and inhuman treatment, poor healthcare facilities, and lack of privacy. What happened during this unexpected, sudden situation is that it aggravated the whole pre-existing poor situation in all life aspects. We're not talking here about the judiciary only. As for the Israeli side, the report addresses it briefly, but the Palestinians in Israeli detention centers have been subjected to discriminating policies, while hundreds, for example, of detained Israelis were released to protect them from possible infections, detained Palestinians were not subject to similar protective and preventative measures. Another example is the Israeli Supreme Court's ruling in which it was stated that 450 people detained in one of the prisons of mostly Palestinians did not have the right to social distancing. While the Palestinians detained in Israel detention centers staying under bad conditions of overcrowding and poor nutrition, for examples, the arbitrary detention and arrests of Palestinians have continued during the pandemic, although increasing number of which were testing positive for COVID-19. On the other hand, the report addresses, as Yelva mentioned in thorough, the Palestinian detention centers' conditions during the pandemic, and it shows violations of the right to fair trials guarantees as articulated in the international human rights law and other sources. This was witnessed by so many actors and includes the right to physically appear in front of a judge. The report is showing how this right was violated by practices of having no judge available because of serious lockdowns and closure, of course, which prevented to perform judges' obligations to monitor and ensure people in detention were not subjected to any form of torture or cruel treatment, among others, of course. In other cases, the periods of detention were extended in violation of this right. Another right is the right to access to lawyers and legal services, as well as the right to legal aid and legal assistance. Several practices were witnessed in violation of this right, such as preventing lawyers from visiting their clients in detention or contact them, preventing detainees from legal representation. Those practices prevented the lawyers as well from physically seeing their clients, and suspend any form of torture appeared on their bodies or other practices. Although there were chances to communicate with clients via judicial policy, or the clients video called their families, such as what happened in Gaza, such communications did not provide safeguards with respect to privacy in the first place and were not free calls, making them not available or not a right to every detainee. Right to health and healthy environment. In fact, violations of this right inside the detentions were documented before the pandemic. The overcrowding, poor healthcare facilities, and lack of proper medications, for examples. And even though the Palestinian president in the West Bank issued two pardon decisions, as mentioned in the discussion paper, to release a number of prisoners, it was not proved these decisions were planned as part of a national policy to respond to the pandemic in the detention centers, nor the number of prisoners released was sufficient to reduce the pressure on prisons. Now, let's talk about the NGO's role in monitoring detention centers. Of course, different independent actors during normal times are able to conduct unannounced visits to places where persons were deprived of their liberty, among which are the civil society and international actors that are recognized as necessary watchdogs. Before the pandemic, detention centers are particularly sensitive and critical from a human rights perspective because they are naturally environments where human rights are at particular risk. Times of closure, lockdowns, and no appearance in front of the judge and prevention of family and lawyers' visits have added fuel to the fire. NGOs in Palestine have been playing an important role in safeguarding against human rights abuses, also acts as part of the democratic process by demanding accountability and transparency by all state institutions, including places of detention. However, during this crisis, the challenge was faced in the political level. Unexpected crisis which caused powerlessness to control or to plan the work under such conditions. NGOs suspended their work in the field, that suspended unannounced visits to detentions because of the governmental preventative measures and restricted movement policies. In addition, they have either been denied access to detention centers and prisons or occupied with other issues related to the pandemic. We also lacked the coordination between the national and state levels in order to perform the law properly to ensure compliance with the human rights standards, as well as the lack of coordination between national and international actors, nor among the three actors. This leads to discussing the report's recommendations and lift up some hope of well-structured plan in potential crisis. The first recommendation in the report was to ensure the full respect, protecting, and fulfillment of the right to legal services, regardless of the existence of a state of emergency. Of course, we have to consider prioritizing people in detention issue and similar crises and ensure applying human rights standards. This includes guaranteeing at all times that detained persons can communicate with their lawyers via free and confidential access to telecommunications and in physical spaces that enable confidential communications. Although I personally think in the Palestinian context and in the existing poor democratic environment and critical human rights situation, it is very challenging to replace the physical appearance in front of the court or lawyers by online communication or by phones. There are several scenarios in mind if we imagine applying modern technologies that may threaten the detainees' lives instead of helping them enjoying their right to communicate with their lawyers or beloved ones. In this respect, the recommendation in the similar report of Tunisia may be applied perfectly, I assume. The second recommendation is to ensure that humanitarian assistance and oversight bodies and mechanisms have full access to people in detention by applying protective health measures and coordination with the state and international actors. In the end, as we kept saying that we are in this together as part of the social contract, the most important thing post-COVID-19 crisis is to rethink, re-engineer, and renew the social contract between the state and its institutions from one side, and the civil society organizations and citizens from the other side. Through collective and planned actions, we can enhance the readiness to respond to potential crises and to ensure the best practices in applying a human rights approach in the state's institutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Saja. Thank you very much. We will now continue with Raji Sourani. Raji is a Palestinian lawyer who has defended and promoted human rights in Palestine, in the Middle East, in North Africa for decades. And I think that most of you probably know him quite well. Raji established the Palestinian Centre for Human Rights decades ago. I was trying to think, Raji, is it 40 years or something like that?
Almost.
Almost, yes. And it started in order to document and investigate human rights violation committed under the Israeli occupation. But when the Palestinian Authority was established, the Palestinian Centre also extended their mandate to also document and investigate what the Palestinian Authority did. So he has defended countless victims before Israeli and Palestinian courts. And it's, of course, an honor to listen to you today, Raji, and especially as I was referring to your great experience of defending victims in front of courts, how that has, how COVID-19 has affected that possibility now. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Agneta, for these nice words, and thanks for ILAC, for organizing this, and special thanks as well to Yilba. She worked very hard with our team at PCHR and Al-Haq in order to conclude such fantastic report. I think to begin with, everybody should remember that still Gaza is occupied by the Israelis since 1967, and this is de facto and de jure situation. Second, we have to remind everyone that it's not the occupation for the last 15 years. Gaza subjugated to unprecedented blockade. It's persecution for 2.2 million people, and nothing moved in or out without Israeli permission. They didn't satisfy with that, but we witnessed as well 4 wars against Gaza in the eye of the storm, civilian and civilian targets, and there was quite a lot of loss, among other things. I mean, you know, affected. Even operation theaters were bombed, hospitals were bombed, shelters were bombed. So civilians were in the eye of the storm, and civilian targets as well. What's unique in Gaza's situation, that the health system entirely was destroyed. I mean, before having this pandemic, due to the occupation and especially due to the blockade. And we have very, very poor health system, not because we are lack of professionalism or resources, but because the occupation doesn't allow development, and especially in the health sector. They don't even allow transferring medical cases to Israel, except in what they call it life-saving cases. So the pandemic is very clear in Gaza and very effective on the life of people. And I want to say as well that this pandemic influenced the life from A to Z. We have one thing, that we have delayed pandemic. We are almost a year beyond the invasion of pandemic to any elsewhere in the world. And why is that? Are we lucky, unlucky? That's because of the blockade. Nobody coming in or leaving out. So that's, I mean, it's a matter of luck. I won't be grateful for the occupation for that. But this shows a reality. I mean, we cannot come in or go out, and movement almost mission impossible. Now, how this affected our justice system, our lawyers and researchers, I mean, worked very hard on this, and we do have at PCHR, among other things, I mean, we have 26 lawyers, young ladies and men who are working this profession, and they are divided into 2. One working at the Sharia Court, and others, you know, from local to international level. So regarding, I'll take them sector by sector, regarding Sharia Courts, I mean, where our fantastic men and women, I mean, represent the women there. The pandemic, when it was invaded, I mean, it invaded Gaza, but Sharia courts continue to function for very, very strange reason. And they were the last to close. And we decided, I mean, you know, to close PCHR, but our lawyers who work at the Sharia court continued with that, with very minimal contact with our clients, but they have to appear, I mean, in the court. And that position of PCHR, after some time, imposed at the Sharia judges to stop functioning, because it became really, I mean, very, very dangerous and very crucial. But this siege, this closure of the Sharia courts almost lasted 1 year. And since May, everything back to the track. I mean, things are back normal. Why back normal? For a simple reason. I mean, 11 days, nobody of the 2.2 million people thought next day will come, next dawn will come, he or she would be alive. So people, like, after this last May war, entirely careless. They don't care about COVID-19 or anything. So I mean, Sharia courts began to function almost normal. I mean, after May, since late May, I mean, everything back to normal. Military courts almost stopped, and people, I mean, were in the prison, and usually these courts are for espionage and collaborators cases. But these people, I mean, I would say, were there without any due legal procedure. I mean, unfortunately, they didn't appear in the court. They have no right to appear, or lawyers cannot go, cannot appear, they cannot do anything. And that's created, I mean, very, very serious problem in military courts. Criminal courts, I mean, same things applies less or more. So even, I mean, using digitalization, it was like mission impossible because the system is not up to that. And some primitive procedures, I mean, began to be introduced to that, and now it's developing. But again, I mean, since May, things back to normal. But for a period of 1 year in the criminal court, in the military courts, situation were really, I mean, bad. I have to maybe say one thing positive. Some who should receive light sentences for pandemic reasons, they were released from the prison. But that's, I mean, also, I mean, way how confusing the situation was. I mean, you don't reward them, people, but you give them proper conditions, I mean, to stay and live under. Regarding civil court system, yes, it was delayed for sometimes. There was real obstruction for the interest of the people. There was almost mission impossible having access to justice in civil court system, and all civil procedures almost paralyzed. But lucky enough, I mean, after some time, especially after May, things are back to normal. So we can say at large, digitalization, it's one of the most important issues needed for the court system to avoid and make the conditions of the prisons more human, more adequate. With the pandemic, that's a must. But I'm afraid that even if we say that, we are absolutely lack of any basic resources, I mean, to improve this. And that's where international support, I mean, needed and needed badly. There is a new wave of pandemic coming to Gaza. It's hitting very, very hard. And for the first time ever, we were having like 12, 14 people dying every day. I mean, and that's among youth. It's mission impossible to cope with that. Even, you know, people are not so encouraged, and there is something wrong. There is some deformation in the culture of the people, but they don't care. I don't know. I mean, because economical situation is very, very bad, because the security is very, very bad. There is no hope for tomorrow. There is too much suppression and oppression. I don't know, but all in all, I mean, people are not really going to be vaccinated, and we have less than 1/4 of the total community who has been vaccinated. Of course, I mean, the general rules are observed, but in the last, I would say, couple of months, again, I mean, we have this new wave of pandemic, but there is no restrictions whatsoever on the court, on lawyers, on judges, on prosecutors, on prisoners, and things, I mean, like really, I mean, going to normal. That's very dangerous health-wise. Now, one of the most important problems that you know about it, Agneta, that we have vertical split in our judiciary between Gaza and the West Bank. So we have one system in Gaza, we have another system in the West Bank, and that's adding much more confusion, I mean, to the legal situation that we are having in Gaza. We tried, ILAC, led by you, Agneta, for years, tried to bridge this ugly, unneeded gap to have an end for this vertical split for judiciary. Anything can be in split, but I didn't hear one precedent about judiciary functioning with the two systems, one in Gaza and one in the West Bank. Unfortunately, so far we failed, and that's impacting on the situation at large in the Gaza Strip. So I don't want to repeat the recommendations, I mean, that our fantastic team, I mean, reported about it, part of it, even Saja, I mean, mentioned, some others were mentioned by Yelva, but these recommendations are there. And I think the pandemic, COVID-19, I mean, lies heavily on our shoulders. And unfortunately, I think the worst yet to come. We are not out of it yet. I'm sorry to end up with this not nice notice, but we are optimistic, but we have that sort of strategical optimism, I mean. But for the now and foreseeable future, I think the judiciary, the marginalized groups, the women will continue, I mean, suffering out of this. And we are, with all our mighty, not alone, with other women organizations, with other interested people and civil society in this, try to invest our best in helping this. Maybe one good news only, there is what we call it Beit al-Aman, this shelter for women, which provide full protection for many, many reasons. We are the legal advisors for them, and we were able, at the worst situation, they were evacuated for 1 week, but we used our connections. I mean, because these women's lives can be in a real imminent danger, we were able to bring them back, and this was functioning again in very satisfactory way. We are happy about it, and we continue rendering our services, I mean, there. And this place really, I mean, provide vital needed service for women to be protected where their life can be really in very serious danger. Thank you.
Thank you, Raji. We will get back to you. I know that that is a recommendation, I think, in the report also, to make sure that these kind of protective houses can be functioning also through a crisis like COVID-19. So we'll probably get back to that as well. So our last but not least speaker, Chris Decker, has a very long career within the UN, and right now in Palestine, but you have been there for quite some time as well, Chris. How many years is it?
About 4 years now.
4 years now, yes. And you manage the Sawasya, how do you pronounce that?
Yes, Sawasya, yes.
together with UN Women and UNICEF. And I know that you have thought quite a lot about this with digitalization. And although we know that there has been a lot of good things coming out of this, there are also some shortcomings. So please, maybe you can say also a little about that program if you want. The floor is yours, Chris.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you to the organizers and Uwe and yourself, Agneta. I think it's important to reflect after a period of crisis and to examine, what has gone well and what has not gone so well. And I truly appreciate being invited to take part in this event today. As you say, by way of background, I'm the joint program manager of the Sawasya program, which is UNDP, UN Women, and UNICEF. And it is focused essentially on access to justice for vulnerable groups in Palestine. And we have essentially defined those vulnerable groups as primarily women and children. So we're heavily involved with providing support to organizations that deliver legal aid services to people in the West Bank and Gaza. So, I mean, many of the things I'm going to say echo what has previously been said. I will try not to repeat, but I do think it actually shows that many of us see the issues relatively the same way that are here, and perhaps with a slightly different perspective in some cases. And in my opinion, crises magnify or amplify weaknesses in the system. And the problems with access to justice in Palestine are no different during COVID than they were pre-COVID. It is simply that we see the ramifications of a lack of an access to justice more starkly than we would if the situation had been, normal. I take away a few positives, and I certainly take on board what my co-presenters have said, and I don't disagree with them. But I think that there were a few positives in Palestine, and I think they do bear mentioning. So in particular, Saja, I know, has a different take on this, but I do think, the president deciding early on to try and reasonably empty detention centers in order to prevent the spread of COVID, perhaps he didn't have the most altruistic intent, but nonetheless, detention centers were, not completely emptied, of course, but a significant population was released. And, when I look back and I reflect, and at the time and hearing colleagues in other country offices, this was not happening in other countries at the same time. I think Palestine was in fact one of, in the group of the earlier countries doing this. And so, I think we do need to give a little credit there. And I think also very few juveniles were left in detention. And in fact, the few that did remain in detention were deemed to be kept there for their own safety. Unfortunately, again, the amplification of poor systems, social services are not where they should be in Palestine. As Raji says, I mean, obviously Raji is focusing on Gaza, but it's, similar in the West Bank. Social services are not where they should be. And some of that, of course, is due to occupation and, strangling of financial resources that would permit social welfare systems to be where they should be. So some children had to stay in detention simply for their own safety. Here in the West Bank, the High Judicial Council continued to hear emergency cases. And I take on board that perhaps what they deem to be emergency cases is not what some people would classify as emergency cases, and fair credit. But, I do know, having again spoken to colleagues in other places, at times courts were completely closed in other countries. So there was at least an attempt here to keep courts open to deal with, what they deem to be emergency cases. is Raji also touched on in Gaza, the Sharia courts. You know, for our information, the Sharia courts were completely closed for a couple of weeks, maybe a bit longer than a couple, 3 or 4 weeks. But when a case of a young woman received attention on social media concerning her husband's refusal to return the child to her, the Sharia court chief justice in Gaza reopened the courts for emergency cases. And this was, so within about a week or so, you know, this woman was able to get the custody back of her child. And so I think those are a few of the positives. I mean, they're you know, emblematic stories, but you know, there were some of these issues. Now, of course, on the negative side, you know, the services that did not exist or were scarce were stretched to the limit and were simply unable to cope with the needed changes that COVID presented to the world and to Palestine. So I'm glad, you know, Saja brought up the issue of sort of detainees and prisoners in Israel. And I just wanted to mention that, you know, many laborers from the West Bank that had jobs in Israel or across the wall lost their jobs, they lost their entitlements, they lost benefits. And this meant that they had to seek legal services in the Israeli jurisdiction. And this, of course, is very, very complicated, very difficult, very costly. And so one of the few things that we did in sort of trying to realign what we were doing is that we did offer some legal aid support through the Ministry of Labor to workers that were working in Israel in order to try to help them reclaim or recoup some of their entitlements and benefits. So also, you know, another example is that, and again, I think this was brought up by Raji in relation to Gaza, but of course, the situation is similar in the West Bank, that you have shelters. And, you know, the normal procedure with the Palestinian civilian police would be that, you know, a woman would be brought to a shelter. Well, you know, there needed to be a 14-day quarantine. And so there was no place to put women for 14 days before they could enter a shelter. And so, of course, what ended up happening was reverting back to this practice of either getting a family member or a village elder to guarantee the safety of a woman who might be under threat from a family member. And, you know, after a couple of months, a solution was found which expedited the admittance process to shelters. And this was done in conjunction with, you know, PA representatives, the justice sector, and international community. And, you know, frankly, at the time, I was super concerned that this might then become the practice once again. You know, it's very easy to slip into bad habits. And so being quite concerned about this, I was very happy to see that, you know, once this new system was set up that allowed women to quarantine for a shorter period of time within the shelters themselves and then enter in with the rest of the women and children that were there, that the police went back to following the proper procedure, and we weren't starting from square one in trying to get, you know, the Palestinian police to follow that procedure. So credit to them with that. But obviously, you know, shelters were already a difficult situation, not enough places, not enough of them, and this exacerbated that situation again. Another negative was, and still is, the legislative framework is not fully in place to utilize the Mizan case management system. So as you mentioned, one of the things that Sawasya has been working on, and previous UNDP projects, has been a digitalized case management system. But, you know, I don't want to get into a full, you know, presentation on Mizan here, but the case management, if you will, is the engine, but there's many greater aspects to the case management system. So, you know, a whole e-justice, if you will, system is in the process of taking place in Palestine, where ministries, agencies are all linked into the system, in order to speed information sharing and to help with enforcement also. But there are still certain aspects of Mizan which the technology is outpacing the law, frankly, at the moment. And so under Mizan, there is the ability to conduct remote hearings. And again, I fully understand what all my colleagues have said, and certainly during the midst of the pandemic, many people were warning, human rights advocates in particular, were warning, look, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. We don't want to move fully onto remote hearings where detainees are not brought before judges, and I fully agree to that. But again, during very specific spikes in COVID, you could have had a situation where remote hearings could be dealing with some of these emergency cases, because you had a situation where you are putting the detainees at risk, you are putting their guards at risk, you are putting guards that have to transport them to courts, you are putting court staff, prosecution staff, all at risk for possible infection, transmission of COVID. And at least during these spikes, you could have had temporary remote hearings, but the legislative framework is simply not there. And so we have it in the technology, but we can't use it. And so, that legislation to enable remote hearings has been in the president's office for several months, and it's simply not being adopted. So, we have a bottleneck there, and it is something that could easily be fixed, and it's not being fixed. I previously mentioned the family courts in Gaza. Unfortunately, the experience, or at least what we witnessed, was not the same in the West Bank for the Sharia courts or the family courts. And they were closed for a considerable amount of time. And after several interventions and calls from the public, the Supreme Judge finally released the phone numbers of some judges who could deal with emergency cases, but this very quickly led to accusations that only those people who were connected to judges or had higher level political connections were actually able to access justice in these situations. So not a sustainable solution and not a very good solution. And at least in what we witnessed, we felt that the Sharia courts in Gaza actually responded more appropriately than the courts in the West Bank did. But obviously that may be up for interpretation. Lastly, on the negative side, let me just say that there is still no sustainable legal aid system in Palestine. And I hate to say, but the Bar Association is still being very obstructive to the development of a legal aid system that would provide lawyers with a proper wage for work conducted on cases of poor indigent people in Palestine. As I started off by saying, and I've said a couple of times now, crisis amplifies the systemic frailties, and the lack of a legal aid system made an already severe crisis, being COVID, into an even bigger one, because there was just no legal aid available. Legal aid essentially is being provided through organizations, and it's being completely propped up with donor funds at the moment. And organizations had to move completely to using telephones, using technology like internet and so on, in order to provide legal awareness and so on. So I truly hope that the Palestinian Authority will take this issue seriously and push ahead with legislation to create a legal aid system. Let me finish by saying that Palestine has actually accomplished something remarkable. And again, I didn't go into everything concerning Mizan, but a functioning case system and most of the justice system is fully automated. And the ability to be automated within a legal framework is within their reach. It's within their grasp. I would actually venture to say that Palestine is leading the region in this regard, and could be a world leader if some of these last legislative framework hurdles are dealt with. The whole justice sector is engaged in an e-justice exercise where they're looking at expanding and automating business processes not just in the courts, but with the whole sector that touches on judiciary. And so, I think there's certainly some work to be done here, and I hope over the next few years, these advances can be solidified. Now, Ilva had mentioned the notification department. And again, this is another area where technologically that can be accomplished. There's no problem, it's already there. When lawyers log in to the Mizan case management system, immediately notifications pop up, but that's not considered legally sufficient because of the legislative framework. That's not considered notification for the purposes of the courts because of the legal framework. So again, the technology is more advanced than the law at this point. And while the technology can make great advances for access to justice, it certainly can't replace a functioning legal aid system, which provides legal literacy and legal awareness. And this must be a priority and a commitment for the PA, or frankly, we'll be talking about these same issues after the next crisis. And so I truly hope that, that more pressure is put upon them and that the PA finally comes to grips with some of these issues and moves forward on legal aid in particular. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Several interesting issues there to continue to discuss. Well, I actually have one very concrete question, Chris, that you might be able to answer. It's from the ILAC board member, Nina Lahoud, who asks if Palestine has been a beneficiary of the UN Secretary General's COVID-19 response and recovery trust fund, and if not, why?
I have to say I don't know offhand. I'm not aware if they have. I have not heard about it, but I certainly can't speak, on behalf of the whole UN system, and it could be that I simply don't know, but I'm not aware that they have benefited from it.
Any one of the other panelists who knows about this? We'll try to find out, Nina, in another way then. We have also a question which is more directed to you, Raji, because legal representation in Gaza is difficult maybe under all circumstances, but how can it be ensured in the future and in similar difficult situations? I don't know if Raji is with us still. Maybe not.
No, I'm still with you.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Legal representation in Gaza, how can it be ensured? And do you also, if I may add something there, do you see that it's extra problematic because of the division of the judiciary that you were mentioning in your intervention?
Absolutely, Agneta. I think this is a real pandemic problem. I mean, our bar association used to be a bar association we are extremely proud of. And it used to give really, excellent legal aid, even till the mid-90s, I would say. So under the occupation, under the hell of the occupation, when there was thousands of people, used to be arrested, etc., the Bar Association used to provide full legal aid. Many used to volunteer and try to help prisoners. And even the civilian legal criminal system used to provide legal aid for those who are in need, especially those who can receive hard sentences. Now, I think we are in a problem. I'm not happy with our bar association at all. how they function and how they do that. It's not real legal aid, it's rather cosmetical. They wait fund from here or there, while they have a lot of money from the lawyers, and they can afford that. They do legal aid for 6-month period, and somebody's, I mean, helping them with that. I don't know how can you go with a program, you provide legal aid for 6 months or 1 year, and sometimes cases, you know, takes 2, 3, 4 years. I mean, there is no logic even in it. So who is providing, I mean, really legal aid? I would say some human rights organizations, and that's basically goes into 2 categories. Basically, one category, it's in the Sharia court. There is hundreds and thousands of women who are in need for legal aid, legal advice, intervention on behalf of them at the Sharia court, and this is provided by PCHR, Women Affairs Center, others, you know, and this is one of the most wonderful, I mean, you know, programs provided to especially, I mean, women and marginalized people. And there is some cases related to what we call it public domain or public opinion cases. I mean, where some people are arrested for totally unjustified or reasonable or legal reasons, and there will be jump and try, I mean, to help with that, or bold cases where you know somebody, I mean, very severely tortured or tortured till death. I mean, you will find, I mean, many who will contribute and take these cases, but that's not enough. It's, as you suggested rightly, this is basically the entire responsibility of the state, the Minister of Justice. Minister of Justice should provide very specific budget and put it there under the disposal of the court. The court decide for any who are in need, I mean, you know, for legal aid, especially in criminal law, I mean, to give them fees whatsoever, and usually it's symbolic, in order to guarantee justice with its minimal level, that there is a proper defense counsel who can take care of that.
Yes, thank you. Any one of the other panelists who wants to jump in, just let me know. We have many participants are, I suspect, when I'm just looking at their names, that they are part of maybe international organizations working in different ways in Palestine. And we have one question here: if you think, or actually, if the international community in any way can support the Palestinian authorities in improving access to justice for vulnerable groups. How can we as international actors support also the performance of the judiciary and the administration of justice during both the pandemics and similar crises? But I could add, of course, also in normal circumstances, since we have to start there. Chris, I see your hand is up.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up a little bit on what Raji was saying, and I can also slightly address the question you've just posed. I mean, as Raji says, you know, at least again in our assessment, we have found the Bar Association in Gaza has been much more willing to engage in legal aid. And again, I take on board what Raji is saying, that perhaps it's not as effective as it could or should be. But we run into an even more difficult situation in the West Bank, where you know, we have seen the situation and I think, we have colleagues from the organization itself, but I'll keep them nameless for a moment unless they want to jump in and sort of volunteer their name. But, we had organizations trying to provide legal aid in the West Bank, and the president of the Bar Association threatened to take away the license to practice of lawyers that were providing legal aid.
Same thing in Gaza. Same thing in Gaza.
Okay. Yeah. So, when
I'm threatened after 45 years to take my license.
I mean, this is where, unfortunately, what happens is that in some jurisdictions, law is purely a business and not a profession. And, I think as lawyers, we should be taking our code of ethics, our moral code of ethics very seriously. And in some cases, that just doesn't happen. And I think, unfortunately, that is the situation in Palestine. And this is one of the main issues that hinders legal aid. With that said, though, as Raji rightly points out, at the end of the day, it's the state's obligation to provide legal aid, not the Bar Association. And so, you have a politically active Bar Association, and that helps prevent the state from moving forward and actually developing a full sustainable legal aid system. There are certainly plenty of donors that are out there that are willing to assist Palestine in ensuring that lawyers get a fair wage for the cases that they are representing people. One of the very disingenuous things is that the bar here often argues, oh, but you're expecting us to work for free. So there is a bit of, a purposeful misinterpretation of pro bono versus legal aid. And no matter how much you try to engage and sort of discuss that pro bono is not the same as legal aid, immediately that becomes the default position. And so I think, this has been a huge impediment. And hopefully, what I was saying at the end, I hope that the PA will move forward on this, and Raji will be able to speak much better about the authorities in Gaza. Just on on the question that was also being asked, I think there certainly is the willingness on behalf of the international community to assist the PA in advancing access to justice. But the PA also needs to help itself, and this is not always the case. And recently there were a number of amendments to the judicial authority law, which did not go over well, both with lawyers in Palestine, but also with the international community. And this has definitely hurt the standing a bit of some of those in the justice sector, and the willingness of the international community to fully engage with some of the justice actors. But it's there. We have the ability to help Palestine in this manner, but they also need to meet people like Raji halfway, and they need to be working with these organizations and not trying to put up roadblocks to organizations that are trying to provide legal aid for indigent people in Palestine. Thanks.
Sorry. Anyone else who wants to comment on what the international community should think about? Sometimes I, who have followed this conflict for a very long time, sometimes I think maybe we have supported the Palestinian Authority too much. If you see what I mean. You are laughing, Saja.
Yes, I guess it's time to rethink of the strategies the international community follow in Palestine, since there is no proper response, whether in such crisis or even in the critical human rights situation in general.
If I may add something, Agneta, following what just Chris said, human rights organizations, civil society organizations submitted simple, clear-cut memo, legal memorandum to the president And in it, I mean, the president regarding judiciary. This was backed as well, I mean, by the Bar Association. And I think in the West Bank, the judiciary situation at large, really, really worrying. And if these notes didn't been taken into serious consideration, and the president then take serious note of it, and he implemented it, I think there will be a real serious problem. My colleague, I mean, Shawan Jabarin, director of Al-Haq, he was in a meeting with the president, with some others a couple of weeks ago, and he raised this point precisely, very firmly, and he ensured that there is something should happen, I mean, in this regard. We have very critical situation regarding the judiciary in the West Bank, and it needs serious structural reform. Otherwise, really, we cannot talk about independence of judiciary in Palestine. I mean, international community should pay serious attention for that. And I think this memo, I mean, is available at Al-Haq or PCHR or other organizations' website.
Thank you. We are soon coming to a close here. I would like to read a comment that we have received in the chat box from Randafar Kamanji. He says that I think there is a big need for remote hearings in Palestine, taking into consideration the occupation situation, but we have to ensure that this modification will not violate the rights of the accused and his right to counsel, and he should be the one to decide if he wants to use this right or not. So we need to take it case by case.
Yeah. Can I comment on that just? Yes. And also to thanks for that comment, and also to acknowledge that it is a tricky situation, and that we shouldn't rule out remote hearings, of course. And there are quite a lot of interesting research and also guidelines, especially from the organization Fair Trials, that has looked into this more in detail on which type of trials that are more appropriate to move online and so on. And also I also acknowledged or like the comment on the importance of the consent of the defendant, because this in our study on Tunisia, for instance, there was a piece of legislation that was adopted in the early days of the pandemic that did not include that requirement to get the approval of the defendant. So we can get in this dangerous situation as well and adopt lacking or legislation that does not live up to human rights standards, and of course that it's very important to have the approval of the defendant. And in Tunisia's case, it was the judge or the lawyer. Sorry, the judge only. So just to comment on that. And maybe also to comment on the what international actors can do, and I will not repeat what the other panelists have said, but the need to push for structural issues, and like advocacy also politically in many ways of pushing for reforms, and also to look into more data on the justice needs, and where people actually bring their complaints, and in general we have also a sort of upgrading focus traditionally on criminal justice, and we need to upgrade and pay more attention to other areas of law. So that's my comment.
Thank you. Thank you, Ylva. I have another question here now from Khalil and Sarah, which also includes some interesting information here. The question is, can a paralegal system be established to license paralegals to provide legal aid? And he says that some countries, like for instance Zambia, has a 3-level paralegals. Level 1 provide legal representation at courts. Level 2 are providing legal aid at ministries, and level 3 are at community level, and they provide only legal aid. With digitalization, one can link all 3 levels, but this requires, of course, a legal aid law. Anyone who want to comment?
Yes.
Raji, please.
I think we have enough lawyers in Palestine. I mean, we don't have a problem with lawyers, but we need proper training for them, proper qualification for them. I think providing paralegal through our experience was very dangerous sometimes. I mean, because the paralegal deal with the raw material in the very beginning, and in the very beginning, you just begin building the case. So it's not easy, I mean, to give that to somebody really unprofessional. You have to give it to somebody who can appreciate, understand, and have a vision and strategy, I mean, for the case. So I make strong emphasis in case there is, you know, enough lawyers, and we have plenty of them. We can use that in Palestine. Related to the previous question, I want to say something. There is a rule, we are acting in Palestine accordingly. We deal with the occupation as if there is no Palestinian Authority. And we deal with the Palestinian Authority as if there is no occupation. We don't mix up, and we cannot be selective in justice. We cannot be selective in dignity, because that's what all rule of law means. And that's why we are dealing with the Sharia court on the ground, with the military court on the ground, with the criminal court, with the civil court. We are dealing with the ICC and the universal jurisdiction on the same level, but we don't mix up things. We don't want coming Palestinian state with injustice and to be one stereotype of these rotten dictatorships in the region. No, we want Palestine. We deserve, our people deserve, for all what they did, for all what they sacrificed and they worked for. So there is no mix up, and I just want to make the one who raised the question be sure that we don't mix agendas. We work with the PA for rule of law, democracy, and the human rights. And we want very special Palestine in the Middle East, we deserve. And we want to work on the occupation agenda because dignity and justice needed for Palestinian victims.
Thank you, Raji. I would like to ask the panelists if you would like to say something to end with. And I start with you, Chris.
Thank you. I mean, just to say, I think, you know, it's been a very fruitful discussion, certainly, and I think that you know, the issues have come out quite clearly, and yeah, you know, it becomes one of political will, And, on the one hand, there has been tremendous political will with successive ministers of justice, successive chief justices, successive attorney generals to establish an incredible case management system in Palestine, which in fact can technologically solve a lot of the problems. On the other hand, you have a real lack of political will to tackle many access to justice questions, like providing a sustainable legal aid system, like ensuring that you have certain legislative reforms that ensure that the system works in a proper manner. So it's a real juxtaposition. I've worked in many countries, and in all my years, I've been doing this for almost 23, 24 years, and I've never seen a case management system be developed and work and rolled out in a way like it has been in Palestine. And you just think, my goodness, if Palestine can accomplish this with the occupation on top of everything, it should be able to solve, the other issues of setting up a legal aid system, of dealing with legislative reform. And it's not. So to me, that signals a political will issue. And I think that's really where, we have to focus a lot of our energy and try to use our leverage to ensure that that side of the equation is dealt with in a more meaningful way. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Sarah.
Thank you. So just two closing thoughts. One relates to potentially a kind of trite expression that everyone talks about now in terms of building back better, but just a thought on how we can think about response and recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and incorporating legal aid and justice services and advocate for those being incorporated into recovery packages. So thinking about advocating for legal aid being part of recovery packages. I know coming from the US context, there's been a lot of talk about how to address issues around women's workforce participation in our response in our recovery response. And I know one of the findings in the report that I don't think we had the time to discuss today was issues relating to women's labor rights that have been a challenge in Palestine during the COVID-19 pandemic. And that really relates directly to economic recovery as well. So thinking about ways of mainstreaming the conversation we're having today into the broader recovery packages and recovery conversation in Palestine and abroad. And a second comment on the role of the international community, and to thank Ilva for her comment on the importance of collecting data on the needs of the justice needs that people are facing. I wanted to flag that right now there's a huge opportunity created at the international level by the Sustainable Development Agenda, in particular this focus on rule of law and access to justice within the Sustainable Development Goal 16. And just last year, there was a new requirement for states to monitor and report on access to dispute resolution, both through informal and formal resolution mechanisms, and also to look at this for different populations, including by gender, migration status, disability status, citizenship status, and migration status. So this creates a requirement, but also a really important opportunity to start at the global level tracking access to justice, particularly for vulnerable groups. And it creates an incentive in Palestine and at the international level to make sure we continue to monitor this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, good that you reminded us about the work that is done in connection with the SDG 16, because there it's really a chance for the international community to sort of unite around some efforts that we can do together. Saja.
I just want to comment actually on Mr. Raji's last words regarding the mixing between the PA and the occupation and mix up between the agendas. Actually, I'm afraid we have reached the era of the dictatorship already. And it's time, I think, to
for a serious change on the ground with cooperation with the international actors. Like it's time to critically think of the human rights situation on the ground. And I just really want to thank you for initiating writing about this specific issue during the pandemic. We haven't seen anyone in the national level have written about this specific issue. So thank you so much for the webinar, and thank you for just addressing such sensitive issues. Thank you.
Thank you. You have done the job, actually. Raji, some last thoughts?
Keep the good work. We are proud of ILAC, and Yilva was very good in dealing and cooperating with the teams, either with Al-Haq or with PCHR. And I think we are proud of this study, which Basil and Diaghi and others, I mean, try to work on it, and wish you all the best. And irrelevant how bad, ugly, and rude the situation on the ground, always we have to keep our belief in rule of law and strategic optimism. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Raji. Ylva, would you like to say something?
Yes, please. I would also like to thank both Raji and Saja and your teams and PCHR and Al-Haq. It's been a real pleasure working with you, and we are so grateful for the cooperation, and we are very happy that we've been able to connect both and include both West Bank and Gaza in this report. And I also want to thank Ashraf Abu Hayef for his contribution, and also Basil Al-Sourani and Sohail Kharma and Marwan Jaghi from PCHR for their cooperation. Thanks a lot. And just also to add that, and also connecting to maybe what Sarah was saying about international or at the global level, and I want just to support and use that we should support and use the international human rights law framework that exists and that is wonderful in many ways, and we should continue to push for ratifications and use of the treaty bodies mechanisms and the special procedures, because they are so vital specifically now. So that was some final comments from me. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. It's a lot of thank you here, but I will anyway also thank all of our panelists. And I want to thank also our audience. It's quite sad that we can't see you and that you can't ask your questions directly. But thank you so much for participating. And I think that our panelists here are also a good example for one of the very positive messages that I want us all to take with us from this webinar. You have mentioned several times the creativity, the enthusiasms, the trying out to help the clients that we have in the legal profession in Palestine and in other countries in the world. And I think that that is a good sign that we do have some who are in it for business, yes, but we still have a lot of lawyers, judges, prosecutors who really, see this as a profession, and they have shown during the pandemic that they are trying to find ways to support their clients in any way they can. And I think that is a positive sign and something that we can take with us into the future. So thank you very much, all of you. And with that, I close the webinar.